Howdy friends, Simon here. Welcome back to The Proof. Today we're diving into the incredible world of your brain. Whether you're looking to boost focus, protect your memory, or reduce your risk of cognitive decline, this episode is for you. I've pulled together the most powerful insights from some of the brightest minds in neuroscience and medicine. Dr. Andrew Huberman, Drs. Dean and Aisha Sherzai, Dr. Thomas Dayspring, Dr. Kellyanne Niotis, and a little from me too, into one deep dive compilation that covers everything from neuroplasticity and dopamine to exercise genetics, Alzheimer's prevention, and even the impact of creatine on mental performance. It's the ultimate brain upgrade, backed by science and grounded in real-world strategies that you can apply today. Let's get into it.
What are some of the kind of most amazing discoveries about the nervous system, say from the last 50 to 100 years? I'm assuming that technology and skills have come a long way in the field of neuroscience. Are there any particular pieces of science that are, up there as very critical sort of milestones or discoveries?
Yes. And so at risk of giving an answer that's too long, I'll kind of hit these in bullet point form because I've never been accused of being concise. First of all, there's an enormous batch of textbook knowledge that is not just beautiful, but truly elegant, that describes the basic functions of how we sense, perceive, feel, remember, and behave. Okay, so much too much to go into all in one sweep. But for instance, work in the last 50 to 100 years, and mainly within the last 30 years, of which I've been very fortunate to be a participant. These aren't my discoveries, but I've been around to observe these discoveries in various labs. My lab has made minor contributions to some of these areas, but for instance, we understand how light is converted into electrical signals that give rise to perception of visual images, even the recognition of faces. We can point to specific areas in the brain based on the beautiful work of Nancy Kanwisher at MIT and say, face recognition happens here. And it's built up from a very elementary, literally blocks and lines and dots that are put into kind of a template for face recognition. And people who have what's called prosopagnosia, they can't actually recognize faces, but they know they are faces, but they can't recognize the specific face. So that's just a beautiful example from Nancy's work and from my scientific great-grandparents, David Hubel and Torsten Wiesel, of how you build up representations of the outside world. Because the brain is in here, the nervous system is internal to the body. And so, it has no knowledge of the outside world except the flow of electrical signals coming in. So that I would say perception, and I just gave an example from vision, but we have excellent examples from touch system and hearing, et cetera. The other would be, we understand at a deep mechanistic level now how neurons work, how they fire. And when I say fire, neurons function by signaling each other electrically and chemically. That's the work of several Nobel Prizes, and very deservedly so. We understand how that happens.
Can you explain what sorry to interrupt. Can you explain what a neuron is by definition?
Yeah, sorry, thanks for stopping me. And to clarify, a neuron is a nerve cell. So you have different organs, and you have liver cells, and you have lung cells, and you have skin cells, and you have hair cells, and you have neurons, which are nerve cells. And what makes neurons unique is that they are electrically active. There are other electrically active cells in the body, but they literally send millivolts of electricity down their wires, these things called axons, and dump chemicals into their local environment. And then those chemicals inspire the next neurons to either themselves fire electrical, what we call action potentials. They're sometimes called spikes, but electrical action potentials. Or certain neurons will release chemicals that inhibit or prevent the action of another neuron from firing. A really simple example would be, we have this capacity to make deliberate voluntary movement. So if you move your wrist closer to your shoulder, the bicep is flexing because you have what are called motor neurons that send a little wire down to the muscle, release acetylcholine, and the muscle fiber twitches, it contracts. And so you're doing that. As you're doing that, you are inhibiting the firing of the tricep, the muscle that moves the wrist away from the shoulder, by way of release of a little chemical called GABA, and that occurs within the spinal cord. So you have flexors and extensors that are activating and inhibiting one another, and that's the reflection of the nervous system. And there are many examples of this in different parts of the nervous system. Bitter and sweet, for instance, are antagonistic to one another. It goes on and on. So I think those are examples that we understand something about perception and how we perceive. The beautiful work of Eric Kandel at Columbia University and others showing that we understand a bit about how the firing of cells in this region we call the hippocampus. Should also mention John O'Keefe and others who figured out that we have neurons in an area of the brain called the hippocampus that encode memories. And while you sleep, those memories are replayed by literally the replay of the firing of neurons in the hippocampus recapitulates what you experienced that day and locks down a memory, passes it off to some other brain areas. We understand something about that. And there are some other discoveries that are just kind of what I would call foundational discoveries, like, for instance, the discovery of the molecule dopamine, this molecule that is involved in our sense of motivation, drive, and craving, and that in its depletion is responsible for the diseases like Parkinson's, and in its excess are responsible for, in some ways, for diseases like schizophrenia and mania. So, I mean, if you look back at the last 100 years or 50 years, you say, okay, they discovered dopamine, they discovered how nerve cells work, they discovered the structure of the nervous system. I mean, that goes back a little bit further, but neuroimmune interactions that the nervous system can activate the immune system, amazing. For instance, sleep and dreaming has a particular structure of neuronal firing. I mean, even as I describe this, I've been doing this a very long time now. I was fortunate to get into neuroscience quite young. It's still boggles my mind. And when people say, oh, we don't know how the brain works, that's kind of a silly statement. I mean, there's a lot we need to know, but so much has been discovered that 50 years ago we knew very little about.
Yeah, it's wild to think about how many things are being done at the same time.
Well, right. And, and I think we can make some broad categorizations that make it, that simplify what is a immensely complex process. So we have this autonomic nervous system that's making sure that your heart is beating and that you're breathing and that your digestion is occurring in the background. You're not thinking about that. You have a voluntary motor system that you can do things if you choose or not do things if you try. And then you have this capacity to direct your attention, which is incredible. I mean, we have what's called interoception, which is our ability to bring our attention to our internal milieu. Think about your heartbeat or your breathing and, everything within the confines of your skin. But you can also simultaneously exterocept. You can view things in your outside environment and pay a lot of attention to something in your external environment. You can forget about yourself. So we have a dynamic regulation of our attention. And it's happening all the time while the autonomic nervous system is doing its thing and while you're walking down the street. So the nervous system is an incredibly efficient system for running multiple scripts at once. And they sometimes collide, right? I mean, if you're really stressed, your visual perception narrows, for instance. If you're very relaxed, your visual perception broadens. You get a much wider view of the world around you. So these systems interact, but they are capable of working as what we call in parallel. And I think I don't think I've ever talked about this on any podcast, including my own, but parallel pathways are the fundamental feature of the nervous system, that things are happening all at once, as you said, in parallel. And the nervous system's job is to make as many things automatic as possible once they are learned, so that you don't have to think about your breathing. And you don't have to think about whether or not that person walking down the street is someone you recognize or not. It's just almost instantaneous. In fact, when you walk down the street, you're making distinctions all the time. Is that a young person, an old person, woman, man, or whatever category you happen to bin people in? You're doing that reflexively as you're going down the street. You're not thinking about it. You're just doing that. And you're activating modules of how to react or how not to react. And that's an amazing thing. And, with no disrespect to people that work on other organs of the body, but the nervous system to me it's so vast. And, we're very blessed to have a sophisticated nervous system. All humans have a sophisticated nervous system. Some less sophisticated than others, some more sophisticated.
As I understand it from listening to you a number of times talk about learning and improving our memory and ability to recall and take on new information, there seems to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, two sort of key components. One is the focus, the sort of application side of learning, and then there's the consolidation of that later in these deep sleep-like sort of states or sleep itself. Can you kind of speak to how that all works together?
Yeah, and you're exactly right. Learning is a two-stage process. And the learning I'm referring to is specifically deliberate learning. Children are learning passively all the time. They're taking in new information. Their brain it's not a complete tabula rasa. It's not a complete blank slate. There's some hardwired functions they show up with, thank goodness, like breathing, like heart rate, controlling heart rate.
That helps.
But that helps. I mean, offload as much as you can to the genetic program to hardwire the nervous system so they can learn how to walk. And walking is a good example. A kid learns how to walk and then walks reflexively. But of course, at any stage, you can think about how you're walking. You could do hopscotch, and you have to change your cadence of jumping and walking, right? So that's this flexible transition between voluntary and involuntary movement, but you have to learn how to walk. What we're talking about now is generally deliberate learning, language learning, skill learning, learning knowledge of any kind, learning how to, navigate the emotional dynamics of a relationship, anything. Two phases. One is active engagement and focus. Much of the trigger for neuroplasticity as a process is engaged by dopamine and norepinephrine and a molecule called acetylcholine, which is liberated from multiple sources. We always talked about how acetylcholine controls the contraction of muscles, but in the brain, acetylcholine mainly comes from two sets of neurons, one in the brainstem and another in the basal forebrain, and it serves as a kind of a highlighter, marking particular connections or neurons that later stand a chance to become stronger. So let me give an example. I don't speak a second language, but let's say I decide I was going to learn conversational French. I would learn some nouns or some verbs. I would focus on this, and the greater degree of focus that I bring, the greater amount of acetylcholine is released at that time, and at the particular locations in the brain they're involved in enunciating the words and writing the comprehension, multiple spots within the brain. That kind of marks those or flags those areas as potentially changing later. But the actual rewiring of the nervous system happens during states of deep sleep or sleep-like states. And so so when we say neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change in response to experience, that's a two-part process. It's a process. It's not an event. We always think about things as events, but in biology, almost everything is a process. So the takeaway from this is, in order to learn at any age, the most critical thing is that you bring as much focus and active engagement to the learning, the encoding of the information, bringing in the information, and then that you get into a state of deep rest as quickly as possible. Typically, that would be the night after you learn, after you have this trigger. But there are some beautiful studies published in Cell Reports last year and the year before showing that people who take a 20-minute nap within the 4 hours after these triggering learning, or people that do a non-sleep deep rest type protocol, even just sitting there quietly and not doing anything, they learn much faster. In other words, the brain rewires much faster.
Isn't that interesting?
It's very interesting, and what's happening is very interesting. We've long known that during sleep, there's a replay of the neurons in the same sequence that they were played during the activity in the earlier in that day. Sometimes even backwards for some reason. It's like the song's played backwards at night. Who knows why? I don't think we should focus too much on that right now. But that replay is the consolidation of the information. You learn. This is why you try something physically, try it physically. You can't do it, and then you come back a week later and voila, you can do it. You had the opportunity to change the neural circuits so that now you can do it. These non-sleep deep rest or these shallow naps of 20 to 30 minutes also create a replay or a firing of the neurons. But there's an additional tool. There's a tool which is get as focused as you can, but then relax as deeply as you can.
For how long? Like, if you're going to be focused on something, is there a certain amount of bandwidth we have where it's productive and then it becomes unproductive?
Yeah, and it varies for people, and some people use pharmacology to override what I'm about to say, but generally after about 90 minutes, we exist on these so-called 90-minute ultradian cycles. Everything in sleep is a 90-minute cycle. Everything in waking is a 90-minute cycle. If you sit down to work, you're like, all right, I'm finally doing it. I'm going to turn my phone off. I'm going to write this book. You just wrote a book. So quite nice book, by the way. I enjoyed reading. I'm learning a lot from it. People should read it. Is it out now? This is not a promotional thing by design. It's good. I learned a lot. I learned a lot of science about nutrition.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, it's meant to be. It's in the ocean. Yeah, it's out in Australia. It'll be out soon.
Okay, cool.
I think by the time this goes up, it'll be out.
Yeah, I learned a lot of nutritional science. I mean, I as you know, I'm not purely plant-based, but I try and eat like it's.
Yeah. You're doing a great job.
I'm trying. Okay. Your audience can send me some information.
He's doing a great job.
I'm trying.
Trust me.
I'm always trying. So you read this information, you bring in the information, and then but after or you're working on the book and you're like focusing, and of course, people think that the expectation is that you're going to be like a beam of focus for 90 minutes. That's not the case. You can flicker in and out. You're going to get distracted. You bring yourself back. I mean, focus is an active process of bringing that spotlight of attention back. It's always
much easier without the phone. Much
easier without the phone. Much easier using a program called Freedom, free program online where you can just turn off the internet.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you, it's very painful, as you know, and yet there's something deeply satisfying about completing one of these 90-minute bouts. You really feel good in your brain and body because we were actually designed to do this.
Mm. It definitely feels like a grind at some stage.
Oh yeah. And that friction and that anxiety sometimes that we feel is adrenaline. It's supposed to be stressful to learn. It's this idea that we just sit back and learn, or that, movies have really destroyed the notion of learning. The idea that you're going to like pick up the sword and suddenly have the skills, forget it. It's like, this doesn't work that way. I mean, it's friction. And some days are good and some days are worse. If you slept better, generally it's better. People are always trying to optimize how much caffeine, background noise, yes music, no music. You have to tweak things according to your circumstances. But after about 90 minutes, you should really take a break and let your mind go idle somewhat. Ideally, you would take a 20-minute nap or a 30-minute nap or do a non-sleep deep rest protocol within the first hour to 4 hours after that. But a lot of us have a lot of demands. You go straight from a 90-minute bout to commuting. Sleep that you get that night is going to be the most powerful tool for wiring the nervous system, right? That's when it really happens. And so we can talk about tools to get into deep sleep and stay asleep more if you like. But there's another thing that you can do, which is that there's a beautiful literature on what's called gap learning effects, where let's say, and this has been looked at for physical skill learning, for music learning, math, et cetera, where if every couple of minutes, just randomly during your intense learning or focus, you pause and you just take 10 seconds and do nothing. Just let your brain idle, eyes open or eyes closed, doesn't matter. What happens is your rates of learning actually increase. And the reason is, now they've done neuroimaging on this, really excellent studies published in great journals, show that during those little gaps that you're taking, there's a replay of the neurons very fast at something like 10 or 20x the speed that normally they would be rehearsing it. So you're getting more repetitions by stopping every once in a while. Now you actually have to do the work, and how many of these to insert, and it should be random. So there are some free apps out there where you can set like a random buzzer, or just every once in a while you're writing or trying to do something, you just pause and do nothing.
Where was that tool when I was going through school?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the science on this dates back about 20 years, but it's only now that there's enough of what I call a kind of center of mass around these studies that really point to the fact that gap learning effects are really strong. They're very beneficial. You learn faster. So it's focus, rest. And that can be done on the micro level, like within that 90-minute block. Let's just make up a number for fun so people have something to anchor to. If you're going to sit down and do an hour of work, let's say for every 60 minutes of focus or learning that you try and do, introduce 30 gaps of 10 seconds at random, and truly at random, not on a regular interval. And then sometime later that day, if you can, do an NSDR, non-sleep deep rest. And if you can't, okay, no big deal. You won't learn as fast, but you'll still learn, provided that you get into deep sleep that night. And let's say you have a lousy night's sleep, you'll still learn, but you won't learn as well. And maybe the next night you stand a chance of encoding that information. So neuroplasticity involves a very strong trigger, and then deep relaxation is when the actual rewiring occurs. And there are exceptions to this, but I should just mention, because it brings us back to an earlier point, that when you think about the tools that people use to enhance focus, Ritalin, Adderall, L-tyrosine, excessive amounts of caffeine, nicotine, those all help with the trigger part, but they don't help with the relaxation part. And so a lot of people don't learn. They just get really good at doing, but they don't actually learn. So very effective people, regardless of workplace or activity, sport or cognitive work or otherwise, perform very well because they're very good at regulating the seesaw of focus, relax, focus, relax. And in the long term, it also is very health enhancing as opposed to health depleting. I mean, I know a dozen or more people who have done very, very well in business or academia who are a mess they're physically a mess, they're emotionally a mess, they're mentally a mess, their relationships are a mess. People that I, consider successful are people that are very successful in multiple domains of life. And that almost always correlates with an ability to engage and disengage, deliberately engage and deliberately disengage.
Yeah. This is reminding me, although a different setting, but a similar concept of work and then relax. Back when I was about, I must have been about 19. I had a friend of mine. He's gone on, actually. I haven't seen him in about 10 years. His name is Jake Nicolopoulos. You can look him up. He's gone on to become a professional bodybuilder. Okay. And when I was 19, I think I was like his first training partner, and he was far better than I was at lifting weights, and really I was just there to spot him. And he had this strategy, because he wanted to become a professional bodybuilder from a very early age, of working out, and then he would sleep under his desk after have a nap during the day. So different setting, but similar sort of concept or strategy there. Yeah,
I think the way to think about it is, that, and thank you, Matthew Walker and others who have emphasized the importance of sleep. Matthew was really kind of first man in on trying to convince the world that this whole idea of you'll sleep when you're dead is really foolish. And listen, I think it's a fact that in order to get good at anything, unless you're just an absolute talent, you need to apply yourself and work hard, and sometimes work longer and harder than you feel like working or is healthy for yourself. I mean, that's a reality. But Matt, I think, really pointed out that sleep is important for learning and a number of other aspects of health. I think that the ability to toggle back and forth between engaged and disengaged states, and to see that whole process, engage and disengage, and the dynamic control of that and deliberate self-control of that is a superpower. And we tend to only look at one side of the equation, the leaning in. I always think the way I like to think of it isn't so much as a seesaw, is you can either be back on your heels, flat-footed, or forward center of mass. I stole this from Pat Dossett, the founder of Made For. He did 9 years in the SEAL teams, and so I like that forward center of mass is great, but it's energetically demanding, and you need to learn how to come up to just flat-footed every once in a while. Now, when you're back on your heels, that's a sign that likely you were doing too much time forward center of mass. No one wants to talk about this, but people who grind rarely succeed and then just take off and do something else. I think humans have mastered this process of engaging and disengaging on a longer time scale. Work hard, play hard, or they'll take a long vacation. But what I'm talking about doing this is across the day. I'm talking about regulating your nervous system within the unit of the day, or even within the unit of the morning, or within the unit of the afternoon. And I think that that's a much more useful, at least to me, a much more useful time bin to conceptualize this. Because the idea that you're going to, sell the company or launch the thing and then you'll rest. Okay, but you can be so much more effective if you know how to dynamically control your nervous system in real time. And great athletes know how to do this. Great musicians know how to do this. Even within the playing of a piece of music or within a race, they know how to reserve energy so that then they can kick at the end. Or in academics, you learn, I was always on the quarter system, which is a 10-week system. You learn how to pace yourself through the quarter, because otherwise you're coming in screeching at the end, and you then get 2 weeks off and it's really stressful. You're just trying to recover your health, and then you're back into another cycle. So I think one of the reasons that I'm not superb at this, but one of the reasons I've been, at least partially successful in maintaining a laboratory and doing a podcast, and I like to think, you can ask the people in my life, decently effective in my personal life, is that I think all the time, am I pushing too hard? Yes or no. And there are times to go forward center of mass. Don't get me wrong, but this can be done with forward center of mass can be done, if you wanted, through drinking caffeine. In the supplements that we talked about earlier, or pharmacology we talked about earlier. The main way to do it is to get in that kind of inspired and motivated pursuit. But then physiological size, non-sleep deep rest, reverie, all of that is very useful. But the foundation of that whole process, there's a third layer, which is sleep. When you're well rested, you're able to engage this forward center of mass, flat-footed thing at will much more easily. When sleep suffers, everything suffers. And so I always say, when people come to me and they say, listen, I think I have attention deficit or I've got anxiety, I always just say, how's your sleep? You want to always start with sleep. Great sleep makes everything better. And then once that's in place, then you can start thinking about some of the other processes.
I'm coming off the best 7 days sleep I've had in months. And it's no coincidence I'm back in LA with my 8 Sleep Pod 4 Ultra. It's a high-tech mattress cover that transforms your bed into a sleep optimization powerhouse. You get precise temperature control, automatic elevation, and biometric tracking, with the temperature control being my favorite feature. The pod uses machine learning to adjust the temperature throughout the night between 55 and 110 degrees Fahrenheit, helping you fall asleep faster and stay in deeper sleep stages for longer. It even detects snoring and adjusts bed position to reduce it, something that you and perhaps your partner can benefit from. Clinical studies show the pod can improve sleep by up to an hour per night, and I've definitely noticed lower overnight heart rate, better recovery, and more energy the next day. If you care about performance and long-term health, this is a game changer. Head to 8sleep.com/theproof and use the code THEPROOF for $350 off the Pod 4 Ultra. You'll get a 30-day trial and they ship to many countries worldwide.
Let's start with the first question that I kind of wanted to frame this conversation with. So what do we understand about the relationship between exercise and various domains of cognition? Do we have different studies that have looked at people who exercise less or more or particular types of exercise and some sort of association between that and cognition?
Absolutely, yes. So there has been several studies and several meta-analyses and systematic reviews actually that have looked at specific types of exercise and then combination of different exercises and its effect on global cognitive outcomes, which means, general memory and cognition scores, and specific aspects of cognition as well, like attention or language or processing speed. Overall, the results show that people who essentially conduct a regimented exercise program, whether it's twice a week or 3 times a week, but regimented is the specific aspect of it that is important, which means there has to be continuity in that action. They tend to do very well as far as their global cognitive scores are concerned, which means they have better functioning brain. They process information faster. They remember things better. They actually have better visual spatial functions as well. Now, as far as specific types of exercises are concerned, it just depends on the different type of population, their age, and some confounding factors, such as cognitive reserve, how educated or how, cognitively active they were, etc. But it seems that a combination of both aerobic and strength training exercises tends to be very, very favorable as far as global cognitive function is concerned.
And as far as specifics, like Aisha said beautifully, the areas that seem to be affected most powerfully is focus and executive function. Mm-hmm. Now, all of the global cognitive elements are affected. We know that all of them are affected to some, but the parts that are affected profoundly, almost like magically, are, I hate to use that term, but exponentially, let's say, let's not call it magic, is attention and executive function. And executive function is, like I said, processing, problem solving, and things of that nature. And those two have been repeatedly shown to be affected positively.
Right. Mm-hmm. And you see these effects in both, healthy individuals who don't have any baseline cognitive impairment. You see it in people who have very mild cognitive impairment. And there have been a lot of studies that have actually shown this effect of improvement in global cognitive scores, even in people who have some level of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's disease. And it's wonderful to see that uniform effect of exercise in multiple different categories of cognition.
I'm curious as to what we're doing with our mind during exercise, how important that is. So if we think about foraging, for example, and the adaptations, we might go into some of those mechanisms a little bit more with regards to kind of what's happening. But if we just think about foraging and the adaptations that we are hypothesizing occurred as a result of that. Foraging would, I assume, require great memory. Where are you in your environment? You're going back to areas where maybe you found food before. You might be looking for certain clues. You have to think about predation. You need to use fine motor skills to kind of pick berries or dig things up. So you're not just exercising, you're out there moving your body, but you're using your mind at the same time. So I'm curious, when we think about movement today and its effect on cognition, is there a benefit to layering on some sort of cognitively demanding sort of task on top of exercise? Or is, I'm looking at, I've got a stationary bike outside, is sitting on that and listening to music for 60 minutes, is that going to be enough?
So the point that you bring up about thinking while foraging, movement, thought, processing, planning, that's such an important point. We didn't just go out there and blindly just jump and start foraging. We always used our frontal lobe, but we always used our processing part of the brain. And that's why it's also connected to thinking. When you exercise, it affects your thinking in both directions. When you exercise and think, there are actually studies that show that when people are on a stationary bike and they have to do some processing or problem solving or memorizing, they actually do better, ironically. Now, of course, you don't want to get too complicated, but they've shown multiple studies that when they do two tasks, it increases cognition. But at the same time, the other way around, that when you actually think and exercise, it affects your exercise quality. It affects your motivational centers. We're talking about the dopamine and its response, and all of that is affected because the combination of the motivational centers, the dopamine and the substantia nigra, I'm not going to name all those mechanisms, as well as movement, as well as thinking, are intertwined for millennia in humans. And that's what makes it so important. It's not just an act of raising the heart rate up. It's the act of raising the heart rate, getting the muscles moving, getting the thinking process going, getting the focus. When you're foraging, for most of our existence, we had to look for predators. We were not the predator. We were not the main predator. Always, it's a discerning phenomenon.
Right.
The number one variable that our survival depended was discernment. Discerning between if that's a tree or a lion, or that discernment is at the corner, at the center of our existence, at the center of our understanding mind. Our sympathetic, parasympathetic system is operating on that level, which is very primal emotional systems. But even our cognitive system, no matter how smart we get as species, we're still driven by those primal discernment tools. Mm-hmm. So these are not disconnected phenomena. When you exercise, you affect thinking, you affect processing, you affect processing speed, how quickly you can process. We know people who exercise, even independent of pushing their brain, their processing speed also gets faster. Right. Their focus gets better. Their attention and memory gets better. And not as a separate phenomenon, as a consequence of exercise directly. Because all of our existence depended on these three phenomena working together. The dopamine, motivational movement, the movement phenomenon itself, and the thinking, discernment, problem solving, memorizing, all of that as well. It's a incredible tool we can use to build cognition. It bewilders me, these schools that actually close exercise programs and they think that they're gaining something. We're not. We're losing tremendous amount of capacity. But when you have kids exercise, especially early in the day, their focus gets better significantly. Patients with attention deficit disorders, when they exercise in the morning, their attention gets profoundly better. Imagine young men who are supposed to be, foraging and out there running. You're holding them in a classroom, a prisoner with 30 other people listening, and you expect them to maintain focus and attention and memory and cognition for 8 hours. It's not even evolutionarily, scientifically sound. So that's why movement is so profoundly important for thinking.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about exercise early in the morning. I know Robin Sharma says early morning activity will activate a pharmacy of mastery. And I was interested if there was anything in that which you've just kind of spoken to. But if we kind of just think a little bit further here with regards to some of these underlying processes that happen when we exercise that could be affecting these different cognitive domains. And Aisha, you mentioned like BDNF and angiogenesis and other things before. And what I'm trying to reconcile in my mind is simply just allocating the time aside to do exercise. It sounds like that is going to have some effect on these processes. But is there a difference between, say, doing that and doing exercise where there is a greater sort of cognitive challenge at the same time? So let's say, for example, I get up every morning, I go for a brisk walk. Person A does the brisk walk in the exact same route every time. Person B changes it and is walking for the same duration and at the same intensity, but is mixing it up, is in unknown streets and environments, and it's a little bit more challenging in terms of working their way back home. Do you think there's going to be a difference there with regards to the sort of effect of that exercise intervention, quote unquote intervention, and how it affects their cognition?
That's a great question. Yes, there is evidence that when people add on a task on top of something that is innately mundane, such as walking or running, they tend to see its benefit, cognitively speaking. There've been research done on multi-component exercises or dual tasks, which means a task that involves physical activity and then an added cognitive activity on top of it, whether it's switching your route or whether it's an actual cognitive activity, like, for example, saying a particular sentence or trying to memorize something or singing a song or at least, keeping the rhythm with a song, anything like that, that challenges the mind seems to exponentially improve cognition, specifically memory. The one area of the brain that gets affected by dual task activities is the hippocampus. And the theories are obviously because of better blood flow, not just because of exercise, but because of the thought process itself. There's better blood flow to the hippocampus and it essentially grows. And you see the change in the outcome in cognitive scores as well. So if people can add a variation to their exercise, say, for example, if they engage in an activity that has multiple different steps that are repeated over and over again. For example, mixed martial arts, or for example, aerobic activity that has particular types of steps that you have to memorize, or even dancing.
Yes.
We were trying salsa the other day. Man, it's hard on the brain. Mm-hmm. Those kind of activities do make a huge difference. And like I said earlier, the beneficial effects are exponential.
Mm-hmm. So trying new things then with regards to movement could be a good idea to sort of keep the body guessing and to kind of challenge the body with new things that require different levels of focus and different motor skills and etc. You mentioned the word grow, Aisha, and I want to speak to you about neurogenesis, but I think this is fascinating, the fact that you can actually grow neurons, develop new neurons. And often we think about growth with regards to exercise and muscle and building muscle tissue. So this is a similar concept. And where I'm going with this is I think most of us recognize that, let's say, for example, you get to your 30s and you don't do any exercise, that by the time you get to your 50s, you will have lost more muscle tissue than you otherwise would have if you were doing some resistance training and you had that sort of paired with good nutrition, etc. My question to you is, let's say that someone listening is in their early 50s and they were active as a kid, doing lots of school sport and sport on the weekends. But then they got to their their late 20s, 30s, 40s, and life got busier. They had children, they were working, and their physical exercise sort of took a back seat. Mm-hmm. Would you see any type of brain atrophy or shrinking as a result of that? And can you reverse that? So in your 50s, if you decide to really to take up an exercise regime, is there a capacity to restore some of that brain function and actually grow neurons at that stage in your life?
The short answer is yes, absolutely. So as far as neurogenesis or creation of neurons are concerned, there is evidence that we do have neurogenesis that occurs throughout our life, that is propagated with two different types of activities, if I had to categorize them, with physical exercise and with cognitive activity. But the number of neurons that are generated in an adult is not as important as the connections that are created between the pre-existing cells. Mm-hmm. And the boost in cognitive function that we see due to exercise and cognitive activity is not because of neurogenesis. It's mostly because of that cognitive reserve or the neuroplasticity that takes place. And neuroplasticity is a term that is used for creation of these connections between cells. And the numbers are incredible. They're crazy. So, each neuron, we have 87 billion neurons after the process of the programmed cell death during childhood. We're left with 87 billion neurons. And these neurons each can make as little as 2 connections or as many as 30,000 connections. So you just do the math of how exponential that volume is. These connections are made and broken at any moment during our life, during adult life. And there's no particular instance unless somebody is left with, a huge brain injury where, part of the brain is completely gone. That process of neuroplasticity keeps on, happening as we age. And we have studies that show that when people engage in physical activities, or let's go with the example of what you said, people who are not even engaging in physical activity, if they maintain a cognitively active life, they continue to make those connections. And the connections are translated in the thickness of the cortex, of the gray matter. And they've done studies, imaging studies of MRI, seeing that people who actually have active lives, they actually have thicker gray matter. The volume of the hippocampus, which are the parts of the brain that basically process memory, they grow as well. So yes, this continues to happen throughout our life, and it's phenomenal to see that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And if we don't do any exercise, what happens to the brain? Have we kind of looked under the hood of someone who's had a life of living a sedentary kind of lifestyle?
Sedentary lifestyle can definitely be one of the main reasons for brain shrinkage.
Right.
We've just like you gave an example of how muscles grow during an physically active lifestyle, but then they atrophy when somebody's sedentary. Same thing happens in the brain. Obviously, there's some other factors that maintain neuroplasticity as well, but physical activity is an enormous boost for creation of those connections.
Right.
And it's because of the release of very important growth factors during physical activity, like brain-derived neurotrophic factor, that essentially promotes the growth of the connections between the cells and also better blood flow to the brain, providing more oxygen, et cetera. And, there have been multiple studies that have looked at, individuals who are prone for having cognitive impairment and brain atrophy. Mild cognitive impairment is a stage. It's a pre-dementia stage where there is profound atrophy of the brain and there is abnormalities in specific domains of cognition, primarily memory. And when patients with MCI were subjected to a regimented exercise program, specifically strength training, over time, over 6 months, they literally grew their brain. Their hippocampus enlarged.
Wow.
Their neurocognitive scores improved. As a matter of fact, in one study, they showed that about 47% of them were able to reverse their diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment and get back to normal again.
Gosh, what was the prescription there? What kind of dose of resistance training? Was that once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week?
Yes, for this particular study, they were exposed to 3 days of strength training. And that included things like leg press and seated rows and mostly core exercises and leg exercises. And when they did some factor analysis, leg exercises seemed to do, to give most benefit as far as cognition is concerned. And they essentially followed that for 6 months. And at the end of the 6 months, they did neuroimaging and neurocognitive analysis. And the results I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
The fun thing about this particular study was that even 18 months later, without continuation of that regimented exercise activity, people tended to benefit from it, which means that their scores actually remained high.
Right.
And their brain function was incredibly improved, which says a lot about that response after a very regimented bout of exercise, that it lingers for months to years.
And just to remind, this is not just individuals who normal individuals, not young people. These were pre-Alzheimer's patients.
Right.
How do you like to explain to someone if someone says, okay, I'm interested in doing some legitimate exercise, some dedicated exercise, then how do you explain to them, a simple way of kind of differentiating between meditation style exercise and something that is actually benefiting their cognition? Is it their heart rate, or is it sweat, or is it whether they can talk to someone? What are the kind of things you would talk to them about?
Yeah, we simplify it as much as we can. We don't talk about VO2 max or calculation of your heart rate and calculation of your BMI. Things like that don't really work, especially when you have such short period of time and motivate people to exercise. We basically tell them, this is what I tell them, so I'll just speak for myself.
Absolutely.
I say, you have to break a sweat and you shouldn't be able to finish a sentence without taking a deep breath. That's good exercise for you. So if you're able to do that, and if you feel that way, just know that your body is getting flushed with growth factors and your brain is getting a lot of oxygen and you're in that zone. So see if you can maintain that for about at least 20 minutes a day, at least 3 or 4 times a week. That's basically my way of saying. What do you say, Dean?
No, same thing. I've heard you say it, and I loved what you said, so I stole your line. So I steal Aisha's lines.
Well, that probably was your line.
But that's exactly right. I mean, you got to break a sweat. You got to get short of breath, and 20 to 30 minutes, 4 to 5 times a week. We can start with 3 to 4 times, but at least 5 times a week is what they've done. The studies say 150 minutes, but there's nothing magical about 150 minutes. As it happens in a study, you have to pick a number. So they've picked 150, and that seems to be the one that shows benefit. But you can, that's the lower limit that you should work your way up. But here's the thing. Again, the community component, the human component, the individual component. We have to start people where they can actually succeed. If it's 5 minutes, because we're more worried about habit than the behavior. So if it's 5 minutes a day that you can actually move and get tired for a while, do that until that becomes habit. Then make it 6 minutes and then make it 7 minutes. So it's about getting the behavior done for that person. And even the exercise, we don't tell people to go to the gym. What can you do what did you used to do? Did you used to like biking? Well, I do, but I don't, it's not a good neighborhood. Well, how about a stationary bike? Well, I don't have the money. Well, how about a foot pedal exerciser? Well, I don't even have, well, how about while watching the news, getting up and doing steps? And so as minimal as possible, but doable. And then checking it off. That's where the dopamine comes up, where you check the activity off. That means that you actually did it. You have a sense of success. You have a measure of success. So that's the key elements are breaking a sweat, feeling short of breath, but more importantly, being able to do that thing repeatedly. That's the key.
And how do you think about the kind of different modalities, I guess, of exercise? Like we've spoken about aerobic, we spoke about anaerobic, we spoke about resistance training. So when you say, try and 3 to 5 times a week, you've got 20 minutes, that's kind of a goal. It's not going to be where everyone starts, but it would be great to get there. How do you think about the different kinds of exercise within or across that week? Is that something that you would speak to people about?
What we were talking about there was aerobic, or the kind of exercise that gets you short of breath, the running, the biking, the swimming, whatever that might be, or stepping in place. The weight bearing exercises, weight training exercises is separate. You start that 3 to 4 times a week and increase it. And we focus on legs quite a bit. Although upper extremity is important because a lot of injuries happen as you get older. Myself, I was doing some crazy things, but injured the shoulder. But the key is leg strength. Leg strength is incredibly important. It's profoundly important. Number one reason for head traumas, falls. Why? Leg strength or lack thereof. Number one reason for hospitalizations, falls, leg strength or lack thereof. Balance issues, blood flow to the brain, blood clots. I mean, the list goes on and on and on how important leg strength is. And as you've heard from our previous talks, leg strength appears to be related to brain strength. People who have bigger legs in studies, and even when they did prospective studies, people who built their leg strength also built brain volume, which was very counterintuitive to me, or not counterintuitive, but kind of weird. Why would leg strength be lead? But that's how important it is. Blood flow increases. Angiogenesis increases, which means blood vessels growing. BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is this incredible growth factor. Nothing increases BDNF more than leg strength.
I think it has to be because of the direct correlation between muscle mass in legs, and the creation or the volume of BDNF creation, therefore boosting better brain health.
Absolutely.
Yeah, maybe we dive into that a little bit more. Why is building muscle important to protecting the brain? I know you've shared some notes with me on that, but there are some interesting kind of mechanisms there.
Well, let's just talk about metabolism. I mean, the biggest medium or vector or space of metabolism is the muscle, right? Yeah, your legs are the biggest muscles, and that's where metabolism takes place. That's where glycogen is stored. That's where fat is stored in your GI and your mid-core section and your lower extremities, and for the most part. And so if you're going to exercise those muscles, they're going to affect the metabolism within themselves, obviously, and even in the periphery, in the proximity. Nothing affects metabolism more than exercise, especially muscle exercises, even muscle building. It affects it that way. And also, as we said, clearance. Your clearance system, be it vascular or lymphatic, operates solely because of your muscles. Your muscles are the pumps that push the lymphatic system. Your muscles are the pumps that push the blood vessels, the veins, particularly. Arteries have muscles, but veins don't, especially in the legs. The leg muscles push them. They have one directional valves. Blood gets caught, and then you push it up, and it goes through the vena cava into your heart and then to your lungs. It works at that level. It works at the level of clearance, waste elimination. When we exercise, lactic acid builds up and all these other waste products build up. Well, guess what? When you exercise, the blood flow gets increased, the lymphatic flow increases, and you eliminate waste. So at every level, exercise affects blood flow. It affects your nervous system. It affects metabolism. It affects waste disposal. Is there a better system for maintaining body's mechanisms of metabolism and blood flow and waste than exercise? Not that I can think of, especially legs, especially lower extremities.
So for the direct relationship between lean body mass and brain health, the relationship has been through BDNF and cerebral blood flow due to muscle mass, especially in the lower extremity. Beyond that, it's extrapolation of the data, and we're learning more and more about the specific association between lean body mass and muscle building and brain health in general.
You mentioned VO2 max before, and that's often used as a sort of measure of cardiorespiratory fitness. Mm-hmm. Is there a relationship between that and brain health? So as someone's VO2 max goes up, do we see less cognitive decline? And I'd be really interested to know, and I don't know if anyone's ever done this, but has anyone looked at an elderly population of endurance athletes with a great VO2 max and looked at their incidence of sort of MCI or Alzheimer's dementia later in life?
That would be a neat study, wouldn't it? To the best of my knowledge, I don't think that has been done as of yet. So VO2 max being a validated measure of oxygen capacity has been studied in relation to brain volume. And it looks like when people have high VO2 max or that capacity, what happens is their brain blood vessels, they change specifically very quickly, and they don't cause any impediment to blood flow. So when people have an athletic body or they're used to exercising on a regular basis, their brain blood vessels welcome oxygenation rather quickly compared to those who have a sedentary lifestyle. And as far as brain morphology is concerned, there is an increased volume of gray matter in people who have high VO2 max. Now, it would be super interesting to actually see how a group of athletics, individuals with high VO2 max do as far as their cognition is concerned compared to those who don't have it. That hasn't been really studied yet.
But on the other side, flip side of it, people who have low VO2 and like COPDers and we're talking about not just athletic, but the other side, the pathology side, there's many studies that have shown that they have poor cognition. They have significant smaller brains, be it because of COPD or untreated sleep apnea and other things where the VO2 is actually on the lower side on a consistent basis.
Yeah, that's true. On the pathological side, you actually tend to see white matter disease as well, which is inflammatory changes to the tiny, small little blood vessels that oxygenate the brain. So that's the pathological side of it too. Yes.
Right. And for folks that are sort of interested or listening and thinking, how do I increase my VO2 max? That goes back to that moderate to or even to high intensity exercise through your life is going to be a way to improve cardiorespiratory fitness and VO2 max.
I'm always on the lookout for ways to refine what's already working and make it better, whether it's in training, nutrition, or recovery. And that is exactly what Momentous has done with their upgraded 100% plant protein. If you're vegan, plant curious, or just trying to find convenient ways to eat more plant protein for your long-term health, this one is certainly worth a look. It tastes great, the texture is super smooth, and the ingredient list is about as clean as it gets. No gums, no fillers, just grade A, 100% pure Colombian. Oh wait, that's a quote from below. But you get the picture. It's made with pea and rice protein, sourced exclusively from the US and Canada. And as always, it's NSF certified for sport. That means that every batch is tested for heavy metals, contaminants, and label accuracy, the same standard that is used by pro sports leagues and the Olympics. Head to livemomentous.com today and use the code LIVINGPROOF for 35% off your first subscription order. Omega-3 fatty acids are the most important fat for the brain.
True. So far, to the best of our knowledge today, they are. And this comes from multiple different studies, studies that look at consumption of omega-3 fatty acids as food, and also omega-3 fatty acids as supplementation. Dean and I published a couple of papers a couple of years ago, looking at multiple different papers that have come out that look at omega-3 supplementation in two populations. The majority of the studies were done in children and in elderly populations to see whether supplementation improved cognitive outcomes. And they had different kind of neuropsychological testing endpoints for children versus the elderly. The data wasn't very clear. We don't have very clear outcomes, but there was a trend. There was a trend towards improved cognitive outcomes, both in children and elderly, when they had enough omega-3 fatty acids in their dietary patterns and when they supplemented if they needed it. And when you look at the pathophysiology of, say, let's talk about the elderly population. As it happens, omega-3 fatty acids are necessary for maintaining the infrastructure of the neuron and the neuronal connections. As a matter of fact, 57% of our brain is made up of DHA. And it needs to be replaced on a regular basis. Our reservoir goes down significantly when we don't get enough of it. People always think that we need to eat fat. Brain is made out of fat and we need to eat fat.
And cholesterol.
Yeah, and cholesterol. Yeah, it is made up of fat. When you look at the dry weight of the brain, it's about 50% fat. But the kind of fat matters. We don't need saturated fats. As a matter of fact, our brain doesn't have the capacity to internalize saturated fats or cholesterol. We do make enough cholesterol in the brain, in the neurons, that would serve its purpose. But the one kind of fat that we need on a regular basis is the long-chain fatty acids, omega-3.
And is there a kind of amount that you would recommend for people of different ages, or what? I know that you supplement in your life. How do you approach that?
Again, the data is not clean. The data is flawed by two factors. We only saw signal later in life and in early life. And it doesn't mean that in midlife it's not beneficial. It's just that in midlife, our ability to detect delta, our ability to detect change, as far as cognition is concerned, is not good, because there's an incredible amount of cognitive reserve, which means that our cognitive capacity is good enough that even if when there's vacillation, it's so minimal to not be able to be detected by the tools we have. That's a little complicated. But midlife, we probably are affected significantly by omega-3, but we don't have the tools to detect the change that well.
I want to put a pin on this comment because I think this is one of the concepts that is not really discussed in all of the different conversations about brain health and health in general. Just because we don't see a signal during midlife about something, or if people feel fine, doesn't necessarily mean that we don't lay the foundation of disease during that period. Sorry, I just want to
it's beautiful.
Really highlight that.
Well, that's similar to
so
cardiovascular disease.
Correct, but even more so for the brain. The brain infrastructure, 87 billion neurons, billions and trillions of connections. This is the infrastructure that you're creating after the age of 21. Before that, it's the cells, growth of cells. In fact, there's some programmed cell death around age 5 or so that you end up with less cells. But the connections are built thereafter. And much of the connections are related to your environment, how much you're challenged, a bunch of stuff. But also the myelination continues all the way to early 20s. So now you have what they call brain capacity. But cognitive capacity, these are arbitrary terms that are created to describe certain things. Cognitive capacity is the connectivity of the neurons, the infrastructure. Imagine a huge building that's held up by billions of pillars. And so if a few of them are knocked down, nobody sees any difference from outside.
Which means cognition hasn't necessarily changed in a way that would be observable. Observable.
The building is functioning, nobody sees any difference, but the pillars are being knocked down one at a time in your 20s. I want this to be emphasized because it's very difficult for us to emphasize brain health to younger people. We're writing a third book, and a huge segment of it, actually more than a third, is around children and young adults and their brain capacity. And those pillars are foundational. We're knocking them down or building them in our 20s. So everything you eat, your exercise, everything determines those pillars. So the pillars are knocked down, and then in your 60s, now there are enough pillars knocked down where you start seeing the wavering.
So I think in that example, you mentioned a building, so pillars in a building, right? And so that building falling down is sort of synonymous with cognition impairment, right?
Correct.
Being observable. Now, you can take a peek into that building. You could do an inspection and notice, okay, some of these pillars have been knocked down.
Yes.
We might want to get on the front foot here before this thing falls down.
Yes.
And maybe that's something we'll come back to, because I know a lot of people will be interested in, okay, I'm 30, I'm 40. What can I measure? Are there biomarkers or
tests or scans that I can do on my brain that will tell me, hey, you're on the road to Parkinson's, or you're on the road to Alzheimer's, dementia, or Huntington's, whatever it may be?
I think it's the most critical topic that we should be speaking about, because it's in our 30s that it's not just that we're avoiding disease, but we're actually building capacity.
Yes.
That's been our focus in the last few years. It's not just Alzheimer's, but younger people. How do you get the signals to the young people to show that, oh, look, you're losing some capacity here, or you're gaining capacity? That's something, because if you don't have those markers, people are not motivated. Motivation is a complex thing when your life is driven by other factors when you're younger. But that's when it starts, especially when it comes to your brain, and it's foundational. So now, when we looked at the data with omega-3, one of the factors, just one of many, we didn't see any. Most of the papers came back negative because the population they had included were younger people. We didn't have the tools of detecting signal, but we know that it affects them as much, if not more. What we did see signal, and I'm going to get to the dosage, was later in life, or even pre-dementia patients called MCI, or mild cognitive impairment patients, which have a much higher proclivity for dementia. And these populations, you did see an effect. Omega-3 did have an effect, DHA, and it was at higher doses. And the second flaw with a lot of studies were they never saw signal because the doses were lower. Dosage problem. And we were going to talk about other studies that with choline and other things where the dosage comes to us from many years ago accidentally, but nobody focused at dose studies. They were looking at effect studies. So in that population, the higher doses were the dose that saw signal, 1,000 milligrams, 1,500 milligrams. So it's not definitely not definitive as far as the dose, but we went on the higher dose as far as omega-3 is concerned.
One of the other things I've thought about those trials, but it goes across nutrition trials in general, is the importance of knowing someone's baseline levels of DHA or APA that in the study, because you could give everyone 1 gram of DHA EPA, but the levels achieved at an individual level through that study are going to be vastly different. And so another approach would be to somehow personalize the dose for each participant to achieve a given DHA or omega-3 index, and then to say, okay, well, if you get to X%, like 5-6% omega-3 index, whatever dose that is for you, personalized dose, then you're going to have lower risk. It would be another way of looking at it.
Absolutely. I think we're learning more and more that not everybody achieves a particular level if they're given a particular dose. From the studies done in the APOE4 allele population. So say, for example, if someone has 1 copy of apolipoprotein 4, which has been associated with increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, they've seen that when they have APOE4, they don't necessarily transport DHA as much as non-APOE4 allelic participants do. So that nuance and that personalization depends on so many different factors. Are we there yet? No, we're not. We don't know. We don't have enough data to be able to prescribe and personalize a specific nutritional pattern or whatever needs that a person has for preventing Alzheimer's disease. And to tie this concept to the question that you asked before, like what should people do? Like you're a younger person and now you know a lot about brain health. Where do you start from? What kind of biomarkers are there? So the answer to that question is it has multiple tiers, right? So generally speaking, just the awareness that you have to take care of your lifestyle, what you eat, how you move, how you sleep, how you keep your mind active is very important. And that should be spread out as far as, in the form of a public health announcement is concerned. And then going deeper into more personalized and more detailed and more nuanced approaches to personalized medicine for brain health is concerned, there are some flaws in there. There are some companies and some physicians who are kind of taking this way too far and extrapolating way beyond the data and recommending things that are not really based well into science. But we have enough data as far as vascular risk markers are concerned. So for example, If you have blood pressure, high blood pressure, and that high blood pressure is, believe it or not, anything over 120 millimeters of mercury for systolic and anything above 80 millimeters of mercury diastolic. If your blood pressure is over 120 over 80, that's a problem.
Which is a lot of people.
Huge.
A lot of people.
I think the numbers are crazy. Even in the United States, I'll stick to our country. In the United States, people between the ages of 18 to 39, 25% of them have high blood pressure. Just think about that. They need to be on a medication, right? So those are easily modifiable things. I shouldn't say easily. For some people, it might actually be related to some underlying disorder that may need some treatment or something of that nature. So knowing your blood pressure, knowing your LDL cholesterol, we've talked about this in the past. High LDL has been correlated with cognitive impairment and cognitive decline during midlife as well as later on in life. Making sure that people understand what their hemoglobin A1C is, which is a marker of glucose metabolism, what their fasting glucose monitor is. That doesn't mean everybody should be wearing a continuous glucose monitor, but having an idea of what your glucose metabolism is, cholesterol is, blood pressure is, making sure that your vitamin B12 levels are checked, making sure that your vitamin D levels are checked. Those are some of the surface level, easily modifiable risk factors that are available now. And then when it comes to, say, for example, omega-3 fatty acid metabolism, knowing your APOE4 status, and even going deeper down into things like, how does my body metabolize vitamin D? Do I have enough active vitamin D available for my brain to use it, to think better, to function better? Those are a little more, nuanced things that are available. But I always fear of, some of these companies taking advantage of people and selling them things that are not really based on science so far.
I think we maybe spoke about APOE4 testing previously, and maybe you've changed your view, maybe you haven't. But I think at the time you thought, unless you really, really are curious, it might not be worth the money and the stress, because there's not a lot of action you could take that would be different to someone who doesn't know their APOE4 status. Has that changed? Like, if say, for example, I tested and I had 1 copy or 2 copy of APOE4, would that information help me make different decisions?
We have different opinions on this. I would say yes and no. Yes, because now we're realizing, as I mentioned earlier, that, say, for example, your need for omega-3 fatty acids, or your decision of adding fat or not adding fat to your diet, whether it's polyunsaturated fats or omega-3 fatty acids. I won't say saturated fats, because I think there's almost like, a direct relationship between saturated fats and poor brain health. But the need for adding fat and all those kind of small little decisions that we make on a day-to-day basis may change on our understanding of having 1 or 2 copies of APOE4.
Oh boy, you started a big problem here in this family. Look what you did, Simon.
Right, so if someone's listening right now who has 1 copy or 2 copies of APOE4, and they are sort of trying to connect the dots here.
Right.
So my original question was how much omega-3 we should be taking. Am I right in that you're saying if you have a copy of APOE4 or 2 copies of APOE4, you actually may require more DHA and EPA to achieve the same level in the brain?
That's the trend and our understanding. Mm-hmm. That's the pattern. We had a conversation with Dr. Hussein Yassin, who runs the lab at USC, and that's his primary focus. And he's so amazing. I think he said more I don't knows in our conversations than anybody else I've heard, because he's a true scientist. But I think that is the trend. It seems that the reason why we haven't seen any results in previous research studies when people were given an omega-3 supplementation and it didn't work was not because it didn't work. It actually may not have worked because it probably was a low dose. A 250 milligrams of DHA supplementation did nothing. But now that there's another study coming up, and hopefully we'll have the results very soon, they've increased that dose to 1 gram, 2 grams, sometimes even 4 grams for people who carry 2 copies of APOE4. So we'll know.
A lot of times we forget about the unsexy but incredibly important factors like blood pressure or LDL. When we did we lead one of the largest community-based projects in the country, the African American churches here, And when we did a fair, we gave one thing away to the community: blood pressure machines. That's an easy, correctable, understandable thing that it's a biomarker. Talk about biomarker, a blunt biomarker that tells you so much more. And then the next thing was LDL. And so those are the important things to focus on. Now, the nuance of beyond that, for somebody that's motivated, it can have it's a two-edged sword. Because right now, yes, so the only thing we can do is maybe increase our omega-3. Even that's not fully clear. But my worry is that if you're going to spend all that money, all these companies are making money off of you of omega-3 levels and all these and APOE4 status. What happens is every time you forget something, you have nothing to do. You can't do anything about it. But it's going to create a self-fulfilling prophecy, kind of this anxiety, this worry, and it just accumulates because. And I've had patients, and I've seen thousands of patients. So and I've seen people who have tested themselves. And in none of them have I seen the knowledge of APOE4 being of benefit. In every one of them, it was a focus of anxiety. I tell people, assume you have risk, and we all do. If it's not APOE4, it's something else. And just live healthfully. So at this point, but we will be around the corner in a few years, 5 years, where we will have personalized adaptations.
That's the blessing and the curse of working with human beings. When you're a physician, you have all of this knowledge, you have all of this conversation with people, and then you're able to look at statistical significance versus clinical significance. And that's one area that is not really talked about a lot. Just because we have a p-value of 0.001, less than 0.101, doesn't necessarily mean that a person goes from not driving, not being able to write a check, not being able to do their laundry, not being able to turn off the stove at night and lock their door, to someone who's completely fine and does all of these things, So we as neurologists and as public health advocates, we want to make sure that people understand the difference between statistical significance and clinical significance. And a lot of the conversation that is going on in the background, they're not out there to that level where it makes a clinical significance.
Right. I can see to your point, someone attributing any forgetfulness or brain fog to the fact they have 1 or 2 copies of APOE4, and then that's being very anxiety provoking for a certain person, which I think is probably the majority of people. I can think of a few people I know who probably, if they tested and found out they had 2 copies, based on their mindset, it would just be really empowering, and they'd go all in on the lifestyle changes, and that would be something that convinces them to actually start being a bit more proactive with their health. And so I can see maybe there is someone who needs that push.
Yes.
But I definitely see the circumstance where it could be anxiety provoking. My question here on that, which is an interesting sort of sidestep, is what is a normal level of forgetfulness or brain fog for someone who's in their 30s or 40s that is baseline and is normal and shouldn't lead to people sort of freaking out?
What a great question. Because it's, at this point, I should say I don't know. As Aisha said, a good scientist would say I don't know. But I'm going to delve in because we have a podcast.
We have to say something, right?
No, because otherwise I'll be sitting here saying I don't know. And that's a great scientist. But reality is it's a great question because if there's any change, and the change should be not be detected just by you, but by people that know you. If there's any change from a baseline, it's a point of worry. Now, that worry doesn't mean you have the beginnings of dementia. It could be that the anxiety level is bad, or your life is overwhelming, or focus is affected. I say that focus is the gatekeeper of consciousness, and focus is the first thing that affects your cognition, memory, and everything else. And the other part of this is if you fix focus, you open up a doorway to incredible cognitive capacity. Not fix focus, but improve focus. So that's one.
I have to think that focus is taking a hit across the board with mobile phones and the algorithms that are just getting better and better to kind of draw us in.
No, that's why this makes this beautiful question. So if there's a delta, if there's a change from a baseline that you detected yourself or others detected or both, then it should be investigated. Because the first thing people do, and people come to me all the time for this, and I detect, there's depression. That's the most common. Anxiety, that's the second most common. Third is they're just overwhelmed. Fourth is medications, certain medications that affect their focus and things like that.
So depression itself as a condition will increase forgetfulness and brain fog?
Well, depression, when we talk about the different kind of dementias, there's the dementia, although it's less popularly used now, it's called pseudodementia. Not pseudo as in false, but it's not a degenerative dementia or a permanent dementia related to depression. People who have severe depression. Their depression is so bad that they can't do their daily activities. When you speak to them, I had one patient, the depression was so bad that they couldn't maintain alertness and focus to the end of the sentence. Not a single sentence could be finished because it would be interrupted by that depression, by anxiety, by loss of focus. That's the extreme. But imagine the whole spectrum. So any level of depression is going to affect your focus, your memory, things of that nature. Lack of sleep. Pain is another important one. So if somebody's having any change in their memory, they should figure out if it's related to any of those. And if it's not related to those, the next thing is metabolic stuff, thyroid. Very common. In fact, one of the things approved by insurance in the United States, one of the few things, is B12 and thyroid as markers of cognitive decline. So check their thyroid. That could hypothyroidism is one of those. And then B12, low B12 levels is another one. So the answer, in short, although I went long, is if there's any change from baseline, investigate, because it's a reversible thing usually. Okay.
And point being there is that it's not always a neurodegenerative process. It could be a bunch of things.
Correct. And treatable things. By the way, if they're treatable and you leave them like as the way they are, it can get worse to the point that it becomes a neurodegenerative process. For example, sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is obstruction of oxygenation during sleep because of blockage or central sleep apnea. So there are studies that show that as sleep apnea, untreated, can increase your risk of dementia significantly. Some studies say 70% and others, but it's significantly. So that's a treatable thing, either with weight loss, with surgery, or more commonly with these devices that can, and that's completely true. But if it's not treated, then it becomes forced attention and focus, fatigue, mood disorders, even stroke and heart disease, but definitely cognitive decline and dementia.
I want to double click on some of these neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, dementia, or some of the other forms of dementia that perhaps we haven't spoken too much about previously, and Parkinson's, Huntington's, etc. So maybe just to kind of set the stage for that, you could just define what neurodegenerative disease actually means. If someone's hearing that for the first time and is thinking, that's a broad term, what does that encompass? And within that, what we're most likely to experience? What are the top neurodegenerative diseases that are affecting people in Western countries?
Yes. So that's neurodegenerative diseases are diseases that happen at an accelerated rate of cellular death. It's usually a process that's initiated years before the onset of the symptoms, but then at some point they become accelerated and the cell loss is significantly more than what you would see in normal age. How you differentiate the different kind of neurodegenerative diseases is twofold, actually threefold. One is timeline. Certain ones are very fast. That's not the most common. The other ones are the type of the proteins that accumulate or are part of the disease process, whether it's alpha-synuclein in Parkinson's and Lewy body disease or it's amyloid or tau, and so those pathologies tell you what are the causes, and also location early on. In fact, when people come to me for us in a clinic when they're having early or even late disease, we usually have a family member there, and the first questions we ask is, when do you think this all started? And they say, oh, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago when they started having some problems. And what was the first signs? If it's memory problems, especially short-term memory, disproportionate to long-term memory, then it's more likely to have been Alzheimer's type. And so with dementia, it's not like other systemic diseases where you can get a biopsy and say from the biopsy what the disease is. You can do that in humans as well. If you take a biopsy, it can tell you a lot. I looked at 1,000 brains when I was doing a fellowship at UCSD, looking at Lewy bodies, but we don't do that. We have to look at a consortium of things. One of the most important parts is history. And with frontotemporal dementia, it's different. Usually it's behavioral or language type. And those are the two main categories. And with Lewy body disease, it's movement disorder and cognitive together.
Lewy body being another form of
dementia. Yeah. With vascular dementia, it's stepwise declines. The person is fine, and then they had a little decline. Oh, I remember that in June something happened, and so that's one of the things. Or they had a major stroke. So the original stories give you a picture into what this could have been.
With Alzheimer's, why is it that it's typically short-term memory that's first affected?
Beautiful, because the first area that's affected is the temporal lobe, specifically the hippocampus or the memory centers of the brain. Those are the areas that are first affected.
In most of these neurodegenerative conditions, the symptoms or the presentation is related to which part of the brain being affected first. Like, for example, in the frontotemporal lobe dementia, it's the frontal lobe. That's why people tend to have behavioral problems. They have disinhibition, they have fears, they have changes in their personality. So it's super interesting. Well, it's not pleasant for the patients, but it's interesting for the neurologists and the neuroscientists to actually depict the changes in the brain. And when you look at the structural and the functional changes in the brain too, it's in very specific areas of the brain.
And what's short term? Is that me forgetting where I put my keys half an hour ago? Is that forgetting who I spent time with the day before and had lunch with?
It's such a common question, because when my patients, especially the men, say, Dean, I'm fine. I can remember 50 years back. It's just the breakfast I forget sometimes, or where I lose the keys. That's short-term memory. And ironically, the long-term memory is preserved, not at least at the beginning. What happens with these diseases, they all at the end or in a few years, they all start looking the same because it starts involving all of the brain, right? It's the beginning that they're different. So short-term memory is breakfast, it's the keys being lost, it's a name that you were just told and you forget, but multiple of them. So those are short-term memory elements.
It's fascinating because when these patients come into the clinic, some of the mild Alzheimer's disease patients are the most eloquent, most friendly. Like, you would not be able to tell that they have Alzheimer's disease. They will start speaking to you about 20 years ago and all the details of their, say, for example, what kind of projects they did, what kind of places they went to, what kind of events they had. But then you talk to them and then you ask them what year it is, or what is the day today, or where do they live, and they have no recollection of that.
With frontotemporal lobe dementia patients, one variant of it, for example, we know that Bruce Willis was found to have frontotemporal, but semantic or language variety. So they're fine, they're working, they're doing it, but they can't find words. There are two kinds of language disorders. But the behavioral ones or executive function ones, their memory is fine. In fact, when you do the testing, their memory was fine. They've been doing everything, but they just forget the basic steps of how to program the TV, or even less complex, how to manage their checks, how to drive. They get in a car, they forget how to go through the process. So the frontal lobe executive, and that's a clue that's more frontal lobe.
That sounds very frustrating to find yourself in that position if you have the available cognition to recognize what's happening.
Yes, it's the most frustrating thing I've ever seen, and it's a lonely journey, because most of these people, they're all, in their 60s, 70s, 80s. A lot of my patients are people that have had interesting lives, all of them. I mean, great lives, and now they are not able to do the basic things, and a lot of times families don't recognize that, they don't know what's going on, and it's absolutely devastating.
For me, the reason I get upset very much, I've become a very negative and a pessimistic person. Well, I'm a nice person, but I get upset. About you. It is true, especially in the realm of Alzheimer's disease, when you hear all of these, individuals out there spreading misinformation about brain health and Alzheimer's disease. They haven't sat across an Alzheimer's patient. They haven't sat across their family to see how frustrated they can get. And they're just grabbing onto things, whatever is in front of them, to see if it can help.
right? So you can't give them false hope about this disease being reversed. And that's why whenever somebody says reversing Alzheimer's disease, like, be very careful with what you say, because you're playing with people's hopes.
So dementia, it's this umbrella term. Alzheimer's dementia is the most common form. Is that like 60 or 70%?
Exactly. And then we have vascular dementia, which is about 10 to 20%.
And vascular dementia is not a neurodegenerative condition, but
Correct.
It is a major category of dementias.
Yeah. Because a neurodegenerative meaning that a process within the cells that slowly kills cells. And vascular, it's little mini strokes kind of a phenomenon. And we'll talk about that.
So different underlying mechanism, but sort of manifests in a similar way by affecting the brain.
Correct. And then we have frontotemporal lobe dementia, which is about 15% or so. Then we Lewy body dementia, Parkinson's dementia. And then we have all these other categories, which is multi-system atrophy, which are faster, much faster. They're a combination of Parkinson's and autonomic problems and movement disorders and cognition all in one, but in rapid form in 3, 4, 5 years. And then you have Huntington's dementia, and then lots of other smaller categories, post-traumatic or metabolic, alcohol. Yeah, Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, which is in alcohol.
And what about early onset Alzheimer's? Often that is a phrase that I've come across. What does that actually mean?
By definition, 65 and below. So anybody who develops dementia before age of 65, they call it early onset. A great majority of those are Alzheimer's type, the one type I was talking about earlier, which is presenilin 1, presenilin 2, and APP. There are familial groups, like in Columbia University, huge communities that when you go there, you see 50-year-olds, a bunch of them in the same families who have this. But there's a lot of people that spontaneously develop this anomaly, this genetic abnormality. And it's a smaller proportion, 3 to 5% of all Alzheimer's, all dementia. And it's a little bit more rapid. And the other thing about this is, and the early onset, frontotemporal lobe is also earlier than Alzheimer's. So for the audience, if the symptoms are starting before 65, it could be early onset. It could be frontotemporal lobe dementia, but it could be other things as well, alcohol-related, Wernicke-Korsakoff, autoimmune diseases. There's these autoimmune diseases that can cause this, for example, Hashimoto's disease in a small percentage that can develop dementia. And then paraneoplastic disorders. So there are other disorders as well, besides the early onset Alzheimer's, that can cause this.
If someone's listening thinking, okay, what is my chances? Is it a 1 in 10 chance I'm going to get dementia? Is it a 1 in what chance am I going to get Parkinson's? Can we sort of put some perspective around this, around the likelihood that someone's going to experience some of these sort of more common neurodegenerative diseases?
The average person, this is not a person that lives a particularly healthy lifestyle, but the average person, 1 in 9 individuals over the age of 65 develop dementia and Alzheimer's type. And then after the age of 85, 50%, 47, but 50% develop dementia and most likely Alzheimer's type dementia. And it's very prevalent, very common, and it's becoming more common for 2 reasons. One is we are living longer, although not in U.S. Our age actually dropped from 80 to 78 to now 76, going towards that. But the other reason is we're surviving other diseases, from cardiovascular disease and cancers and HIV and other things. So we're living to the point where we're more at risk of developing these diseases. And the third factor is we're living less healthy. We believe that, and there's data, it's not a matter of belief, that lifestyle is a big contributor of this. We think as much as 80% of this is lifestyle related. And it has to do with food we eat, with the way we interact, how much we move, the stress levels in our lives, lack of sleep or proper sleep, and then mental activity. These are the factors, and alcohol and cigarette smoking are other factors, especially alcohol. Cigarette, it's been reduced globally, but alcohol is a big factor. Those are the contributors and reversible contributors to risk of dementia.
And I think it's important for the audience to know, and this might just be a refresher because we've talked about this in the past, the proportion of people who tend to have a genetically driven disease is much less than those who have a lifestyle driven disease, especially when it comes to Alzheimer's disease. It's not even, it's not 50-50. If somebody has the genes or the type of Alzheimer's disease that is purely genetically driven, it's between 3 to 5% only. The rest of it is all lifestyle.
Those are the genes that typically would drive early onset Alzheimer's?
That's correct.
That's correct. So
which
those
is the
are the
presenilin.
Presenilin 1, presenilin 2, and amyloid precursor protein, or APP. And that happens to a very, very small population. So
I think some people may confuse that with APOE4, which probably gets a little bit more airtime. So what happens to someone's risk if they have one copy of APOE4 or 2 copies of?
So if you have one copy of APOE4, your risk goes up as much as 3 to 4 times. If you have 2 copies, your risk goes up as much as 10 to 12 times. But does that mean that people who have APOE4, 2 APOE4 alleles, which is about 2% of the population in the United States, they all get dementia? No, 50% never develop dementia, and it's related to lifestyle. As the data shows that it's related to lifestyle. The Nigerian study actually showed this, and other studies have shown this, that and then mechanistically, although we kind of push back on mechanistic explanation of things, it's a good thing to have. But what is the function of APOE4? APOE4 is one of its functions. It's not the only function. People simplify it. One of its is lipid transport, fat transport.
Right. It's the APOE equivalent in the
Correct.
brain.
Exactly.
Correct.
Yes.
Exactly. And we know what it does in the brain. When it's in the brain, it doesn't do its job well. And our relationship with lipids, especially LDL, matter because of one of the reasons APOE4. So even the second highest penetrant genes, and I'll explain what penetrance means. If a gene is 100% penetrant, it means it's going to manifest in our life at a particular time. For example, the Huntington's gene. It's on chromosome 4. It's a sad disease. And it's repeats of CAG codon. And if there's a certain number of them, it's almost guaranteed that this parent had it, their child now has it. We know at what age they're going to develop Huntington's disease. Usually it's in the 30s or so. With Alzheimer's, it's just that 3 to 5%. The rest are not 100% penetrance. It's much lower. Even APOE4, which is a higher penetrance, 12 times greater risk, people who live a certain kind of life have much lower risk of developing Alzheimer's. And then the rest of the consortium of genes related to Alzheimer's, which we now know to be now in the 40 or so genes, are, again, lifestyle related. Genes that deal with how we get rid of waste. Very common. Genes that have to do with our response to inflammatory response. If there are bad genes, which means we don't have a good, proper inflammatory response, more likely to get dementias and other diseases. So again, we can see that genes here have to do with lifestyle, a great majority of them.
Is there anything someone can do if they have those mutations to presenilin 1, presenilin 2, and are in that sort of, I think you said 3 to 5% of category? Are they just ultimately, they're destined to get dementia, or can they, even in that circumstance, modify their lifestyle in a way that...
That's a really good question.
Very good question. So we did a study. We looked at the data. We didn't do the study. We looked at the data. We need to publish that.
Yes.
With an amazing 16-year-old kid that ended up in Stanford, brilliant young man. We looked at who has APP. Well, it's on chromosome 21.
Amyloid precursor.
Yeah. So
protein.
Who has excessive APP are people who have triple chromosome 21, which are Down syndrome, right? So people with Down syndrome, if they live past the age of 40, 50, it's almost a foregone conclusion they'll develop dementia and Alzheimer's. And it's because of excessive APP. And we looked at that data, and what we saw was the main problems that usually Down syndrome individuals have is blood pressure, cholesterol, all of that stuff. When those things were better managed, guess what? They developed the disease later on. So even in the high penetrant genes like APP in Down syndrome, lifestyle had an influence on pushing the disease back. So that gives you a clue that even in those cases, lifestyle is a big factor.
It's almost as if you were given poor tools to maintain a healthier brain. It's like you're not given the right kind of a janitorial system for your brain. You're not given the right kind of a system to get rid of oxidative stress. You're not given the right kind of system to fight against inflammation. And so if you work hard enough not to create that inflammatory response, not to create that oxidative stress, and not to create those glucose metabolism disorders and fat metabolism disorders, you can definitely push the disease further.
We'll make sure we break down neuro again so people understand what that lifestyle, ultimately, what does it look like? What are the behaviors and actions on a daily basis that you can take to sort of swing this in your favor, regardless of whatever genes you've sort of been dealt. So, Dean, on what you just said before, I'm trying to almost just run the maths here. On an individual basis, so we have like a 1 in 9, 1 in 10 chance of developing dementia. If you have one copy of APOE4, that's like a 1 in 5, and then if you have 2 copies, 1 in 2, something like that.
Correct.
But you're of the view that we can lower our risk, for that risk, by up to 80, 90% by getting our lifestyle in order.
Correct. Now, 90% is super optimal. 90% is the extrapolation. We always want to make sure that when we speak, we don't just put all that we say into one clump. There's weight of data, right? This is a causal data, which is very rare, strongly correlated data that comes from a meta-analysis of randomized clinical trials, and so on and so forth. When we talk about 90%, it's the extrapolation of taking all the work that we've looked at, nutrition having 50% influence on dementia, exercise 45 and above, just some of the studies. If you put all of this together, we're extrapolating. So take it for that. I say that exhaustively so that people say that when we speak, we try to be not about just data, but the weight of the data as well. And that's important. But we believe that if somebody lives perfectly optimal life for a long period of time, especially early on, yes, you can 80%, 90% reduction in risk. But even the data that came to us from subpar studies that was published we actually saw in the American Alzheimer's Association conferences and other places, that even subpar lifestyles reduce your risk by as much as 60%. That's remarkable, because none of those studies push the kind of lifestyle we talk about. We're talking about, push the exercise to 300 minutes a week. There was a time we talked about 150 minutes. We're talking about 300, close to 300 minutes, and push yourself, including weight training. We're talking about as clean a diet as possible, as plant-centered. If you're not going to be plant-only, as plant predominant as possible, as clean as possible, and be aware of your vitamin. And just because you're plant aware or clean diet, it doesn't mean that you should then ignore other things. Be aware of your omega-3. Be aware of your B12. Be aware of your vitamin D. Be aware of your thyroid status and other things, irrespective of your diet. Be aware of your blood pressure and cholesterol. And if you are aware of all of that, and you're eating well and clean and exercising, sleeping well, 7 to 8 hours of deep restorative sleep, challenging your brain around your purpose, yes, you can push back Alzheimer's and dementia by as much as 80 to 90%.
A lot of what you just explained comes down to taking ownership. And I guess there's I don't like using the word balance, but you need to work out a way where you integrate this into your lifestyle where it doesn't feel like a chore. Yes. And it's not stressful and anxiety provoking in and of itself, or you're kind of defeating the point a little bit. So we might come back to that.
I say change it from lifestyle to life, because if it's not life, it's only sustainable for so long. The power of our habits are immense. I'm a behavioral neurologist. The most difficult thing to change is our habits. Those habits are not just something that was created in our early life. They're created around our psychological flaws. They're sticky. So in order to change behavior, you really have to make it your identity. It has to become part, not as an extra thing. I'm going to be eating more plants today. No, that should be you. That should be your life. I'm going to, do a practice for a marathon this month. I'm a runner. I'm a walker. I'm an exerciser. That becomes a more realistic, sustainable thing than a lifestyle.
I think one of the challenges here is that you're talking about lifetime exposures to risks, but a lot of people could, when they're thinking about neurodegenerative disease and dementia, you associate it with older people. So you have to really engage in delayed gratification to make this work, because you're going to be choosing behaviors and actions that are protecting you many, many years down the road.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there are some short-term benefits that they can actually, when they're aware of, they can see. For example, you sleep, when you live a certain way of life, your sleep will improve, your attention will improve, your mood will improve. We don't ever measure those. We don't make ourselves cognizant of those things. It's time. It's time to kind of create metrics for your focus.
That's a good point. There are some benefits up for grabs.
Oh, right away.
And I wanted to add that when people think of brain health, they essentially just dichotomize it into being healthy and unhealthy. If we think of brain health as a spectrum and as a journey, I think it would make more sense. The fact that we have tools only to detect dementia in a population is so wrong. There is a huge sector of population that live with cognitive decline, and nobody ever checks that. And that cognitive decline doesn't necessarily start happening in our 60s or 70s. It actually starts happening in our 30s and 40s. And this is not fear mongering, but it's just an indication that scared me just a tiny bit. But it's an indication that, these individuals that come into our clinic, and these are, say, for example, a 35-year-old working mom who says, I'm just forgetful. I don't remember things. I'm so forgetful of what happens. It's actually affecting my life. It's not something to be scared of, but that's cognitive decline. We experience it in our 40s. We have people who actually have high blood pressure, and there's a term called, hypertensive encephalopathy, where their blood pressure is so high that they can't really focus on things. They're actually confused. They lose their train of thought in the middle of a conversation, let alone come up with creative thoughts. That happens in our 50s and our 60s. People who have diabetes, they actually have poor memory as well. Nobody ever checks that. We always talk about, amyloid, brain shrinkage, but that's as if, an analogy would be if there's a car accident, and we just saw a car accident on the highway coming here, everybody focuses on the damaged car. There's ambulance, there's police, there's firefighters, all focusing on the damaged car. They don't really look at the road that led to that. They don't actually look at the engine that was, something was wrong with the engine, or they don't really look at so many other factors that resulted into that as well. So there's a lot of cognitive decline out there in the population. And if people are just aware of that fact, I think it will make them take better care of themselves.
So that after my previous statement, people don't feel this overwhelming impetus to abandon this whole thing because it's all or none. It's not. A morning walk, the Harvard study, a brisk morning walk, a brisk walk in general, but especially I love brisk morning walk, and we'll talk about why. But a brisk walk, with the operative term being brisk, where you get tired. I keep coming back to that theme. If you think exercise is not just, meandering and walking. You got to get tired. Reduced chance of Alzheimer's by 45%. 45%. Do we have any drug, any of those vitamin concoctions that they sell? None of them have shown even 1% of improvement. None of them. Yet a brisk walk, 45%. And the power of exercise is just immense. And you'll see the difference. You'll see it in mood alteration. You'll see it in better sleep. You'll see it in cognition, especially if you make yourself aware of it. Let me see if this experiment I'm running, where I'm going to walk every morning, is going to affect my focus. And you'll see the difference. So I want people to kind of shift towards those kind of metrics as well.
Lately, I've been thinking a lot about toxin exposure. And one thing that I've been paying close attention to is PFAS, or these so-called forever chemicals. They're found in things like non-stick cookware, waterproof clothing, food packaging, and even our drinking water. And they don't break down in the body. Research links them to endocrine disruption, metabolic issues, and perhaps even various types of cancer. I have a scientist coming on the podcast soon to unpack all of this, but in the meantime, I've been using Function Health to test my own PFAS exposure. Function is an all-in-one platform offering over 100 advanced lab tests, including tests you'll be familiar with from this show that we've spoken about, like APOE and Lp(a), and now PFAS. That is about 5 times more testing than you would get in a standard physical. Most of us have some level of PFAS in our bodies due to the environment that we live in. The question is, how much? If levels are high, testing gives you the knowledge to make changes, like filtering your water or switching to PFAS-free products. Function is easy to use with 2,000 plus lab locations across the United States and a membership that's just $499 per year. No supplements, no prescriptions, just real, unbiased health data. Head to functionhealth.com/Simon Hill to get started. That's functionhealth.com/Simon Hill to get started today. I think a lot of folks worry about kind of forgetting things as they get older. And I'm sure this is a question you get all the time. What is normal forgetfulness? And just, you're so busy, you forget something, or you forget a word that you had been using frequently, but then you find it, versus actually early signs of dementia that someone should be aware of and perhaps more concerned by?
This is a very common question, and it's really difficult to answer because there is a lot of overlap between normal cognitive aging and a neuropathic process. So normal cognitive aging, word is on the tip of your tongue. That is really common. You have word blocking when you really can't think of that word. Those things happen to everybody. As you alluded to, attention is a big problem. So I like to tell people there are stages that your brain needs to go through to form a memory. One of those is you have to pay attention so that you could actually learn the material. If you don't pay attention, you will never remember that information later on. 9 times out of 10, when someone comes to me and tells me that they're having memory complaints, they don't remember a conversation they had, they're losing their keys, it's because they're so distracted by all the other things in their life that they're not really focused on what's right in front of them. Or there are other external factors, like they're stressed out about something in their life, they're not sleeping well. All those things can have short-term impacts on memory. So important to rule all of those things out before you start thinking about, could me not remembering the right word be a sign of something more serious? In people who have certain high risk genetic variants, which we'll talk more about with Tom, like APOE4, or in people who have a profound family history of dementia, I would just take all those complaints a little bit more seriously.
Remind me when we get to early learning as one of the risk factors that we come back to this idea of attention and focus, because I have to wonder if the increased use of mobile phones and apps and the distraction that kind of poses for the youth could be setting people up for kind of less cognitive reserve and perhaps declining cognitive function as people age. But let's put a pin in that and come back. While we're on this, on the topic of dementia and defining things, you mentioned that Alzheimer's dementia, I think you said that was the most common form of dementia. Just how common is Alzheimer's dementia and some of these other kind of more prevalent forms of dementia, and how likely are we to experience one of these?
Yeah, so what's really difficult about saying how much of dementia is from Alzheimer's disease or how much is from Lewy body is that at the end of the day, clinicians are really bad at diagnosing these diseases in real life, and often we have a formal diagnosis after death. So it's difficult, but we'll give the umbrella term. Neurodegenerative disease related dementia is about 55 million people across the world. And what's most startling about that is that there are 50 million people who are living in this preclinical stage of disease, meaning they harbor insidious markers of Alzheimer's related brain changes, but they don't have any obvious cognitive complaints, or their cognitive complaints are very subjective and wouldn't flag as abnormal on any cognitive test. That's massive. That's a massive amount of people that are in the coming years going to potentially be in this bucket of people with dementia.
Is that mild cognitive impairment, or is that term used to describe something else? And should we be thinking about this similar to how we think about pre-diabetes and type 2 diabetes?
Yeah, so mild cognitive impairment is not the same as preclinical disease. And I think this is actually really analogous to atherosclerotic disease, because you have this really prolonged silent period where something is accumulating, but it isn't manifesting. That's really the preclinical stage. Sometimes you'll have these subtle cognitive changes, but if you gave someone a cognitive test, they would not score in an abnormal range. Then you advance to this MCI stage, which is mild cognitive impairment. You do have abnormal cognitive function on objective tests, and you probably do have noticeable cognitive changes, noticeable by you or a loved one. And then, of course, you advance to the dementia stage, which is when you lose certain independent functions, activities of daily living become more difficult, and you start depending on someone else to hygiene and eating and dressing and so forth.
So about, I think you said 50 million people globally have a neurodegenerative disease, or 55 million.
55 million have dementia.
And then 50 million are in this kind of preclinical stage.
Yeah.
And you mentioned atherosclerosis, which is a pathology that we've walked through on this show quite a bit. How would you describe the pathology here in the case of dementia? And I appreciate it's probably different for these different forms of dementia, but as you move from kind of good cognitive health to preclinical to then having a diagnosis, what's actually happening in the brain tissue? What do we see?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different things that are happening, but we can base this on something called the ATN staging, which is amyloid, tau, and neurodegeneration. So this is for Alzheimer's disease. So what you see first is the accumulation of a protein called amyloid beta in the brain, also in the blood. After, this can happen for years and years. Potentially, it may never lead to tau. As you've heard, amyloid is insufficient to cause neurodegenerative diseases. Some people, a third of people, are walking around with amyloid in their brain, and they supposedly never will go on to develop a neurodegenerative disease. Tau is the next toxic protein that we see. So phosphorylated tau specifically, and it can be phosphorylated at different locations of this tau protein, which is probably above the topic or above what we should be discussing today. Tau accumulates in something called tau tangles in the brain. And then subsequently, these toxic proteins can trigger a lot of neuroinflammation, which leads to neurodegeneration. There are vascular issues that come along with these proteins that can develop that we see. The vascular issues can present similarly to vascular dementia. Microangiopathic changes that happen. Amyloid can accumulate in the brain parenchyma itself and also in the blood vessels of the brain. But ultimately, this is the stages of what we see as the disease progresses.
And to be clear, that's Alzheimer's dementia.
That's Alzheimer's dementia.
Whereas something like vascular dementia is the pathology closer to what we see with atherosclerosis throughout the body.
Yeah, so vascular dementia is, or used to be called multi-infarct dementia. So it's this entity that there's stepwise progression of cognitive changes, usually triggered by an infarct in the brain or a stroke in the brain that leads to cognitive decline. It can have symptoms that range from similar symptoms to Alzheimer's, which is short-term memory loss, but you can also have a lot of movement problems with it. Parkinsonism is common with vascular dementia.
So is it generally thought that if you address cardiovascular risk factors, you're addressing the same risk factors for vascular dementia?
Yes.
Okay.
Cardiovascular risk factors are key importance when we think about vascular dementia prevention.
Okay, so then we come back to Alzheimer's dementia, and it's this different pathology. What do we understand about the causes of that? what's causing amyloid plaque build up in the first place? Why in some people does it progress on to tau and then neurodegeneration, but not others? How much of this is that person's genetic makeup, what they got from mommy and daddy versus the environment?
Yeah. I mean, if I had the answer to that, I would win a prize. So we don't know. That's what the field is after. And anyone who says that we do know, we don't know. But there are lots of different hypotheses. So, of course, initially, we were all taught in medical school that amyloid is the sole driver for Alzheimer's disease. Well, with the advent of these anti-amyloid drugs, which are beneficial to some degree in some people, we understand that they don't eliminate the disease. And it has led us to understand that Alzheimer's or amyloid is not the sole pathogenic process that's happening in Alzheimer's disease. There's likely factors upstream that are driving amyloid and tau accumulation. And those factors can be things like, I'm giving you my thoughts and what's based on the evidence that we have, things like excessive inflammation and neuroinflammation, things like cardiovascular disease risk factors and vascular changes. Metabolic health is a big driver. Hormonal health in women can be a massive driver. So lots of different avenues can cause these proteins to accumulate. And the whole idea of preventive neurology is let's start addressing these risk factors that drive amyloid and tau pathology earlier in life so that we can prevent them from accumulating.
What's the relation between, I imagine a lot of people are listening and they're thinking, maybe they heard or they've gone and done a genetic test and they have a copy of APOE4 or 2 copies. How does that affect that pathology, the process that you were talking about earlier, going from amyloid to tau to neurodegeneration?
We should double click on this. And this is kind of where Tom has changed my whole world on understanding this. It's mind-blowing to realize that APOE is a lipoprotein.
It's an apoprotein. First it's an apoprotein when the liver makes it. And then apoproteins tend to bind quickly to lipids. Once it binds to a few molecules of a given lipid, usually cholesterol, then it's called an apolipoprotein. And once it accumulates with a whole mass of lipid molecules, then you have a lipoprotein. So there's sort of 3 stages. A lipoprotein is a collection of lipids that are surrounded by water-soluble proteins that provide structure, stability, and in ApoE's case, functionality to a given lipoprotein. So just to be clear on our terminology, an apoprotein is just a peptide attached to nothing.
And so, Tom, based on your genes, you make different proteins? Like I understand that some people have APOE2 or APOE3 or APOE4 in a different combination. What does that look like?
Well, of course, genes control the formation of every protein in the body, but there's some proteins we're a lot more knowledgeable about and seem to be more linked to the diseases that are afflicting most of us or so. So one protein is, of course, apoprotein E. And like all, we inherit genes from mom and dad. We get one allele, a copy of a gene from mom, one allele copy from dad, and then they get together in a given person. So your genetic makeup that's going to produce a protein is got 2 alleles afflicting it. Now, ApoE is a protein that comes in, for today's discussion, we'll say 3 forms, called isoforms. So are they different? Of course they're different, or we'd be saying they're all the same thing. And they're given the names E2, E3, and E4. Believe it or not, it's only 1 amino acid difference in each of those peptides that changes what we call it, but it also changes. You wouldn't think 1 amino acid would have much to do with anything, but with ApoE, it changes everything as far as what ApoE might be doing in a good fashion or a bad fashion. So because we can get an APOE2, an APOE3, or an APOE4 from mom or dad. But when we put them both together, our genotypes are simply going to be E2, E2, E3, E3, E4, E4, or E2, E3, E2, E4, E4, E3, E4, E2. So there's a lot of genotypes. And dependent on your genotype, that person will be producing a distinct type of apolipoprotein E. And when that ApoE binds to lipids, it's going to influence what can possibly happen to the lipoprotein that this ApoE is attached to. So, and then we'll get into this ultimately, but we're talking about two pools now. We're talking about the periphery, where God and you and I have discussed this for lots of hours, Simon, the type of proteins, the lipoproteins that float around our bloodstream. And of course, most of them carry ApoE, with the exception of LDLs. It's like the only lipoprotein that doesn't carry much ApoE. But then we are going to also be talking about the type of lipoproteins that traffic lipids in the brain. And one early little point to drive home is whatever the lipoproteins you have in the brain or whatever they're doing in the brain have zero relationship to the type of lipoproteins that are floating around your plasma. Now, there is ApoE on many of the lipoproteins in your plasma. ApoE does not cross the blood-brain barrier and become part of a lipoprotein in the brain. We will talk about that the brain can produce ApoE for sure, and it does things up in the brain, but it does different things in the plasma and how it modulates what might happen to a lipoprotein trafficking in ApoE. And a lipoprotein in the periphery that might be carrying E2 or E2 is going to cause those lipoproteins to behave very differently than if those lipoproteins were carrying an E4 allele or an E4, E3. The so-called common type, the wild type of ApoE is ApoE3E3. That's what most of us have. So we tend to compare, hey, if ApoE3E3 is the wild type, what happens to people carrying an E4 allele or what happens to people carrying an E2 allele? And then we start to see the differences to it. And as always, the homozygous types, the E2E2, the E4E4, will even behave a little different than the heterozygous type, say an E4E3 or an E4E2. So it does get complicated. Now, we can easily measure your ApoE genotype and see what it is. Now, me dealing with peripheral atherosclerosis, I can correlate certain ApoE genotypes with your risk down the road for lipid disorders or even the development of atherosclerosis. I can even tie it into other things, such as the absorption of cholesterol in your gut in some people. But once we start talking about the ApoE genotype in the brain, and we'll let Kellyanne do that, but a lot of that comes down because you do have brain lipoproteins, and the type of ApoE they have in wrapping their brain lipoproteins, just as I told you, ApoE can affect what various peripheral plasma floating apoproteins might do in the brain. Your ApoE type, the specific protein you have on your brain lipoproteins has a lot to do with, are those proteins going to do the proper things, or are they going to be really dysfunctional type of lipoproteins? So that's a sort of a long mouthful of what ApoE is. It's a very important critical protein that infects the lipolysis, the catabolism, the internalization of lipoproteins in the periphery. And it actually does the same thing in the brain, except again, what is going on in the plasma has nothing to do with what's going on in the brain. So we do have to master lipoproteinology in the periphery. I hope we've done that in our many hours of podcast. But more in today's podcast, or if we have a subsequent one on it, we're going to have to talk a lot about the type of lipoproteins that are present in the brain.
Okay, breaking away from the episode, it's just you and me for a brief moment. As mentioned, there are three major types of ApoE genes: ApoE2, ApoE3, and ApoE4. Each of us have 2 copies of these, one from mum and one from dad. So there's 6 possible combinations that you could have: E2E2, E2E3, E3E3, E3E4, E2E4, or E4E4. E3E3 is the most common gene combination in Caucasian populations and is neutral in terms of risk of neurodegenerative diseases. About 70 to 80% of the population are E3E3. E4, on the other hand, is present in 14% of Caucasians and is the strongest genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's dementia. Less than 5% of the population have 2 copies of E4. This is the most unfavorable APOE genetic combination when it comes to Alzheimer's risk. Having 1 or 2 copies of E4 also significantly increases risk of Lewy body dementia. By contrast, only 8% of Caucasians have 1 or more copies of E2, which is considered a longevity gene and decreases risk of Alzheimer's dementia, but can increase risk of cardiovascular disease and macular degeneration. These APOE genes are responsible for the production of proteins in the brain that help transport cholesterol between cells, from astrocytes to neurons. While it's by no means fully understood, it's hypothesized that people who have 1 or 2 copies of APOE4 have higher risk of Alzheimer's dementia because the APOE4 protein is not very good at cholesterol transport, resulting in too much cholesterol building up in neurons, which ultimately can be toxic to neurons and cause cell death. If you think knowing your APOE genotype would be something that empowers you rather than causing unnecessary anxiety, something that you'll have to decide for yourself, you can get it tested with a company like EmpowerDX, a company that I have no affiliation with. I used EmpowerDX to test mine, and my results were E2E3. I carry 1 copy of APOE2 and 1 copy of APOE3. So thankfully, no copies of E4 and 1 copy of E2, which is protective against Alzheimer's. But now the risk for me here is that I rest on my laurels and just assume I won't get dementia. That's not how it works. Plenty of people without copies of APOE4 still develop dementia. It doesn't mean that I'm invincible and don't need to live a healthy lifestyle. It just means that I'm at lower risk compared to the average person. How do you feel about someone going out and doing a genetic test to see if they have a copy of APOE4 or 2 copies?
It's really, again, based on the individual. I personally think that there's so much value in getting knowledge, but again, you have to really understand what your appetite is. If you feel like this isn't going to change the way that you act and is only going to cause you unnecessary stress and worry, then it's not the right thing for you. But I think for most people, the knowledge is so empowering. And I really, really emphasize that APOE4 does not mean you are going to get Alzheimer's disease, dementia, Lewy body. It is just a risk factor. And it's a risk factor that we actually know a lot about, and we can potentially do things to get someone off the path to neurodegeneration if we understand that you have this risk factor. So to me, it's knowledge that can help change how you act. I think it provides value.
The problem with that knowledge is if you do get your APOE genotype, you are obviously going to have to speak to a medical professional about it. And again, I told you the PCPs and cards know little about brain lipids. Most of them can't give you much of a coherent discussion on what APOE4 heterozygosity or homozygosity might mean. And they could scare the bejesus out of them. They could mistakenly perhaps say ignore it without looking at other things. So the problem is, there's one preventive neurologist here and we're looking at her. So we need, once a person tests themselves, they have to try and find competent care to get answers.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I like to think about all these people at risk, and I'm out here telling people like, yes, knowledge is power and it's so wonderful. But, if you suddenly become aware of what your risk is, where can you turn for help? Right now, it's really hard. And a lot of this is self-discovery and self-education. And that's why there are people like Tom and I out there trying to help spread knowledge so that you could understand this the best that you can, because it is difficult in terms of getting the right type of medical care right now.
And even in my world, knowing the APOE genotype can provide substantial information about cardiovascular risk also. But again, I think if you ask the average PCP and even CARD, how do you tie in APOE genotypes to lipid disorders, you'd get a lot of blank looks back. So it's a problem.
Breaking away from the episode for a moment here, as mentioned earlier, we had planned for this episode to concentrate on the 14 modifiable risk factors identified by the 2024 Lancet report on dementia prevention, intervention, and care. The Lancet report suggests that if these 14 modifiable risk factors are eliminated, or in other words, optimized at specific stages of life, almost 50% of all dementia cases could be prevented. The 14 modifiable risk factors are as follows: low quality education, especially in early life, hearing loss, high LDL cholesterol, depression, traumatic brain injury, physical inactivity, diabetes, smoking, hypertension, obesity, excessive alcohol consumption, social isolation, air pollution, and visual loss. Importantly, these are not all equal in terms of the risk that they pose, with some of these like LDL cholesterol, hearing loss, poor quality education, and social isolation being more significant in the effect that they have on dementia risk. Today, we are zooming in on cholesterol, and more specifically, high LDL cholesterol. And then we'll double back in a future episode with Dr. Kellyanne Niotis to discuss all 14 of these modifiable risk factors. Okay, back to the episode to learn more about APOE4. If someone does their genetic testing and they have a copy of APOE4 or 2 copies, does that affect which of these risk factors you are sort of maybe going more aggressive on or spending more time on? Or is the prevention kind of plan going to be pretty similar to someone without a copy of APOE4 or 2 copies?
I believe in precision medicine. It really does change the way that we treat you. Of course, how most directly how APOE4 relates to these modifiable risk factors is the elevated LDL-C risk factor that we're talking about, and Tom just mentioned. And he can talk more about how APOE4 influences peripheral LDL concentrations. But even when we think about treating LDL-C in someone who has an APOE4, well, that really changes. So for example, APOE4s tend to be hyperabsorbers of cholesterol. They absorb more cholesterol from their intestines. Turns out that we actually have a great medication that can block cholesterol absorption in the gut called ezetimibe. That also has the benefit of not crossing the blood-brain barrier and not doing anything to screw up brain cholesterol synthesis. As we've been honing in on, the brain must synthesize all its own cholesterol. It can't take up cholesterol from the periphery. So while there haven't been any studies that have said that statin therapy is harmful, and I don't think that it's harmful at all, I do think we need to individualize or think about how we're treating LDL-C in relation to someone's risk factors, in relation to other biomarkers, which Tom can talk a little bit more about, and specifically in relation to APOE4, because we understand that their brain cholesterol synthesis or homeostasis is not normal.
You know, just sometimes you think of things that you didn't think of originally. And you mentioned this cohort where high HDL cholesterol was associated with dementia. And we just tied in LDL cholesterol, which is really tying in peripheral ApoB to a risk factor associated with dementia. And Kellyanne rightly knows that in general, people who have E4 alleles tend to be hyperabsorbers of cholesterol. But very interesting, untreated hyperabsorbers of cholesterol tend to have higher HDL cholesterol also. So I would wish that we could go back to that cohort of high HDL cholesterol and dementia and do a sterile absorption test on them. Now, they had very high HDL cholesterol. Typically, hyperabsorption doesn't put you into that range, but you know me, I'm always tying things into lipids.
Reason number 4 to supplement with creatine. Creatine may help your brain recover after periods of stress. This is another new study hot off the press. I've brought you a couple of those today. You're welcome. A really, really cool study. It's well described in the scientific literature that cognitive performance is impaired after sleep deprivation. In fact, I bet you've experienced that yourself. The old brain being a little sluggish after being kept up all night. This was a double-blind, randomized crossover trial. There was 15 subjects, 8 were female, 7 male, average age of 23 years, and they were brought into an inpatient setting and completed brain scans and cognitive tests at 6 p.m. to get a baseline before being kept awake all night. After the baseline testing at 6 p.m., they were given either 0.35 grams per kilogram of creatine monohydrate or 0.35 grams per kilogram of placebo before being kept awake all night and undergoing brain scans and completing cognitive tests at 2-hour intervals from 11:30 p.m. to 5:30 a.m. This is quite a high dose of creatine. For someone who weighs 70 kilograms, it's 25 grams. The rationale being that neurons, a type of cell in our brains, appear to have increased energy requirements after sleep deprivation. And in order to get enough creatine into the brain, you have to administer a very high dose that first saturates muscle cells with enough left over to then cross the blood-brain barrier. Here's what they found. Firstly, the oral creatine monohydrate was bioavailable to the brain, meaning that this single dose significantly raised brain creatine levels. Secondly, when given creatine, subjects had significantly less subjective fatigue. They didn't feel as tired. Third, creatine supplementation significantly improved short-term memory and reaction speed. The maximum cognitive effect was observed at 4 hours post-creatine ingestion, but lasted up to 9 hours post-ingestion. Surprising to me here was that the creatine was well tolerated in subjects with no reports of gastrointestinal symptoms despite the very high dose. So overall, a compelling study that supports high-dose creatine supplementation after getting insufficient sleep if you're wanting to feel less fatigued and feel more mentally switched on. While we're talking about creatine and cognition, a lot has been made in recent years about high-dose creatine supplementation for cognition more broadly, with many on social media now recommending 10 to 30 grams of creatine per day, even for healthy individuals. My view here is perhaps slightly different to what you've come across online. I'm not yet fully convinced that outside of days where you are affected by something like sleep deprivation, there's enough evidence to support high-dose creatine supplementation for cognition, especially in healthy adults. A theoretical case can be made that in people who have insufficient brain levels of creatine during periods of high mental stress, for example, or chronic brain conditions such as Alzheimer's and depression, that high-dose creatine may be beneficial, especially in older adults, but this is far from proven at a clinical level as we sit here today. What about vegetarians and vegans? You might come across this idea online that when it comes to cognition, vegetarians will benefit more from creatine supplementation than omnivores because of their lower dietary creatine intakes, even if they are otherwise healthy. There's actually no good evidence to support that. There's a single study by Benton et al. That people often point to as evidence that vegetarians benefit more from creatine than omnivores when it comes to cognitive performance. But what people are not appreciating is that the result in this study was driven by a decline in performance between tests in the omnivore group, not improved performance in the vegetarian group. There's a bit of physiology here that is important to understand. While it was once hypothesized hypothesized that vegetarians may have lower brain creatine levels. That's actually been studied, and it's now understood that vegetarians do not have lower brain creatine levels than omnivores, at least in healthy subjects. When your brain is functioning properly, your brain creatine level seems to almost entirely be determined by creatine synthesis that occurs in astrocytes, cells that reside in the brain, not from creatine in your diet. This is different to muscle tissue. Muscle tissue creatine levels are much more affected by our diet, and it is true that vegetarians and vegans tend to have lower muscle creatine levels than omnivores. This is why vegetarians tend to benefit more from creatine supplementation when it comes to performance than omnivores. But that said, omnivores still don't get enough creatine in their diet to fully saturate their muscle cells, which is why even folks like my friend Paul Saladino, who eats a very meat-heavy diet, supplements with creatine. Isn't that right, Paul?
Here's a day of eating for me, POV edition. First thing in the morning, pre-surf, I'll have some raw goat milk, add some creatine to that, and a little bit of raw, organic, glyphosate-free honey, and then I'm off to the ocean to chase some waves.
Thank you, Paul, for that cameo. Coming back to the brain and cognition here, as soon as you have some sort of brain injury, be it from acute insults from concussion or chronic from depression, Alzheimer's, etc., it is certainly plausible that dietary creatine or creatine supplementation becomes more important in this context. As we've just seen with the recent study on sleep deprivation, this is an area of active research, so I suspect over the coming years this is something that we will all better understand. Perhaps there will be a creatine protocol for those with depression, Alzheimer's, post-concussion, etc. Or not. We'll see what the data shows. Either way, make sure that you are subscribed to the show here, and I'll be sure to keep you updated. In the meantime, given that creatine monohydrate has a good safety profile at doses up to 30 grams per day for a wide range of people, except those with pre-existing kidney disease, and is relatively inexpensive, it might be something you're comfortable experimenting with until we have more data, especially if you're an older adult, or you're someone who has a history of acute brain injury like concussion and or chronic brain conditions like Alzheimer's or depression. There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.